Welcome to Talking Feds One-on-One, deep dive discussions with national figures about the most fascinating and consequential issues defining our culture and shaping our lives. I'm your host, Harry Littman. Welcome to another Talking Feds One-on-One. The first few days of Trump rule have been a disaster for democracy, with a dizzying series of vicious and radical moves that more than reinforced the fears of all the people who were sounding the alarm for months before the election. Yet the feel remains that many Americans are taking it, if not exactly in stride. The pardons have been unpopular. He begins his term at a 47% approval rating, quite low historically, although that's kind of a piece for him. But if not in stride, then without grave concern. And that's, in turn, a matter of grave concern to nearly anyone who understands the way democracies actually can degrade and who studied the progress or the process in other countries. So I'm really pleased to welcome today one of the most thoughtful and knowledgeable experts on that topic, Andrea Pitzer. Andrea runs the Degenerate Art newsletter. She's the author of 3 books. Most relevant here is One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps. But I'm here to tell you, please look her up. She is a dizzying polyglot, and I first learned of her through her remarkable book, The Secret History of Vladimir Nabokov, on the family history of Nabokov. But you can find out more about her current and past work at www.andreapitzer.com. And to summarize it all would take the balance of this talk. But just check out her most recent book, Icebound, about her voyages, yes, to the Arctic. Okay, so that's who we have with us today. Andrea, so pleased to welcome you.
Well, I'm excited to be here, Harry, but maybe not for the reasons of what we have to discuss.
Yeah, no kidding. All right. So look, I've read your work, and you've pointed out a few different models for democratic decline. Granted that each is singular in some sense. Can you just sketch out a bit of how things have gone in actual real life instances of thriving democracies that are now moribund, and give your sense of the country or countries that have the most on-point lessons for us at this moment in terms of the potential disintegration of democracy?
So I think one thing it's important to sort of say up front is that rarely does this happen in a truly thriving democracy, and that it can begin as a thriving democracy, but usually you do have a period of degeneration. And it's not an accident that I pitched my concentration camp book, more than a decade ago, because some of this stuff was already brewing. And, it's brewed around the world. And as you said, each case is a little bit different. But usually, everybody's making a cake and has some kind of similar recipe. And so I wouldn't pick any single example that reflects everything, but I want to talk about a couple that have things that are really worth considering for where the U.S. is at right now. And I do think, as you noted, that, we are in a heap of trouble. I don't want to be hysterical about it. There's a lot we can do, but I don't think we should minimize it. And one example I think is worth looking at is the example of Chile, which was overthrown by a military coup in 1973. And one of the things that's important to realize about that is they kind of knew it was coming. That was for a period of time when I was down there and interviewing people who'd been tortured or arrested, the people who had actually been in government, an elected government, socialist government at that time. There was a sense of dread. There was a palpable, long sense of dread that's probably very familiar to anyone paying attention right now. And the way that power was seized very quickly, I think, even though Trump does not have the military fully behind him at this point, which is a really important caveat, but that quick seizure of power is one that I think he's looking to replicate right now and that we need to keep an eye on. But more importantly, for the long term, the Chile example is relevant because what the junta managed to do with U.S. backing was that the country split along right and left lines. And those fissures are still there today, half a century later, have not become sort of subsumed in the larger body politic in a real way. And I think this is what the U.S. is staring down the barrel of. I saw that you had talked to Rachel Maddow about sort of fascism in America and some of the earlier times it had appeared. And one of the things she noted that I also want to underline is that originally the fascist impulses in America were not a left-right model, right? It was combined. And you didn't have one of the two major parties adopting this model. But now we are more in the situation of like a Chile, where one side has fully embraced this authoritarian stance and the other side is very much opposition. That's really bad for democracy, long-term and currently. And the other example I wanted to point out, although there are so many, I'll just stick with one other one for now, is the example of Russia. And I know there's been a lot of talk about Soviet-era stuff or Russian interference in the election, and those are relevant, but I want to address some things that haven't really been mentioned before, and or not quite in this way. One of which is that in Russia, I had been for a long time thinking of it that Putin, the president, controls the oligarchs, that there's sort of an agreement between them, but ultimately Putin is in charge. And in the US for the last several years, I mean, you do have tremendous inequality of income that I think is also similar to Chile, to the prior example that we now have in the US, that you also see in Russia. So that's a piece of the puzzle too. But in the US, it was more that the oligarchs that we have domestically were buying the politicians. But we've seen this turn very recently where the oligarchs are bending the knee. And the thought that perhaps Jeff Bezos owning the Washington Post might insulate it from some of this because he has somebody who had so much money, he'd be able to push back. It's kind of shocking that we see as you know, in Los Angeles, as we see here in DC, as we see with Zuckerberg, not just in these donations to the inaugural committee, but in the positioning that they get for the inaugural address, in what is very clearly kowtowing to Trump's power. I think we are right now witnessing this shift that is more like the Russian model. And there's an additional dangerous part to that, which is just as Putin managed to put down a lot of dissent by sort of picking off independent media one by one and squashing dissent. Unfortunately, our oligarchs and our independent media are all one and the same because of the decline of journalism in recent decades. So these are just a couple examples that I think we can see, we're not on a good road and it's got more potential to deteriorate. And those two countries show us some of the ways it can.
It's quite a stunning point, both of the examples. And we were, as I mentioned up front, concerned, sounding the alarm. But this feature, the emergence of the oligarchs and billionaires, you said it in passing, but a stunning little, you as he's doing all these pyrotechnic moves, there are these little things that when you zero in on them, and one is that members of Congress were displaced from the inaugural, and even in order to give the finer seats to the tech folks. But as you say, it certainly seems to go in the direction of their obeisance. And, the example of Russia shows Putin can very well dismiss or extinguish oligarchs when he's had his way with them. And so, you watch, like, where will Elon Musk be in a couple years? But this aspect, which was so reinforcing, or maybe even the engine of Putin's rise to power, is something that is, to me, very much a lesser theme and tell the last couple months. And I just want to take your point also. Chile much better, but that there were already fissures. I've thought a little bit about Hungary here, and when Orban comes to power during the moment where he really will begin to transform it and degrade it, he's returning on in a fair and full in an actual regular election, but where there's a lot of discontent over the previous administration that give him the sort of entree. And as happened here, people were just more concerned about the mishandling of the financial crisis here. the prices in the supermarket and the like, so that the signs that were there, including ways that they could be exploited, majority just tended to neglect them. Let me serve this up, though. So such a kind of array of moves by Trump in his first days in office. And you talked about Chile and the model of a sort of quick consolidation of power. So a few of these arguably could have happened in other Republican administrations, maybe some of the immigration stuff. A few of them, perhaps the tariffs, might be bizarre, but you don't associate them necessarily with authoritarianism. What are the things he is done or seems to be poised to do that particularly concern you as a, really dead center entry in the playbook on authoritarianism?
Oh my gosh. We don't have long enough for that. But I would say...
And in our final round, Andrea,
exactly.
what's the worst of all the... And, no, the audience said his hair. Okay, go ahead.
So I would say that we see him... I think that, a good entree into answering this is actually your example of Hungary, which is, when you look into Orban's history, he was pro-democracy and pushing the Soviets out before he made this turn. And it was really when he learned that there was more opportunity and more power to be had that we saw this massive shift and this reinvention of him. And I think Donald Trump also played along with the Democratic Party, as a non-politician for a long time, until he realized just how much power he could gain by taking this route and embracing all these things that, like Christian nationalism, things we know he doesn't actually care about at all. It's a means to power. And I think that it has always been with Trump, the shamelessness of what he does that has distinguished him from the other administrations. I think they would try to do things quietly or secretly or under cover of night, or limit the political pressure on them to limit certain things in order to keep the respect and the votes of Congress and the people. Even when there were sometimes bad things happening, there was this sense of accountability. And with Trump, there is, just to boil down those million things I could have listed, there is right now no accountability. The founders actually did a great job of they did some bad things, but they did a great job of laying down the framework of checking this kind of power, right? And we haven't built those institutions up enough, or we didn't act soon enough. But what they did not envision was what we have now, which is a compliant judiciary. We have a Congress absolutely under Trump's thumb, and we have a hobbled press. And the executive branch in the U.S., this is something has built across several Republican and even Democratic administrations, is supremely powered already, even before the Supreme Court ruling that we got this summer. And so what I would say is different is not that Donald Trump has changed, but that his shamelessness now is completely untethered, and he can move in almost any direction he wants to. It's as if a chess piece on the board suddenly got all the moves of every other piece, right? And that's not to say there aren't a lot of things we could do to stop him, but the opening position, the opening gambit here in these first days is that there is no one with any significant political power standing in his way. And so he is identifying domestic enemies, and he is creating international enemies. And these are the mechanisms by which people become dictators, is to hound the internal group that's most vulnerable. So in Europe, in mid-century, 20th century Europe, we have Jews, centuries old hatred that could be stoked, right? Here in the US, we see minorities. We see the xenophobia that has come and gone from the US like a fever at various points in history. And so there's no doubt that he's already identified the outgroups, trans people, just like in Nazi Germany. I mean, we see some of the same ones, but particular ones to the US as well. And we see him now also identifying these foreign actors. And when somebody has that devoted following that he already has, and he's already identified those enemies, you're not going to be able to dial that back anytime soon. So, we are on the brink of some bad stuff.
Talking Feds is supported by the Brennan Center for Justice. In this new political era, the Brennan Center will do what they do best: defend the Constitution and the rule of law. They're prepared to fight against presidential overreach and will continue advocating for reforms to resist weaponized government, stop billionaires from corrupting our elections, and ensure every eligible American has the freedom to vote. Stay informed by visiting BrennanCenter.org.
Wow. And I want to follow up that last point, but just a few little things to add. So, at the framers, I think there's an argument they did envision, and they did all they can by way of structure, and it's structures that have held more or less with,
I agree with you. That's what I was saying. They did a good job. Yeah.
Well, okay, but
they made other mistakes.
I think where we are, yeah. Well, you all said, there are different parts of Federalist Papers where they envision exactly the coming of Trump, and I think what it underscores is structure goes a very, very long way, especially when bolstered by history and culture and a whole couple centuries of prosperity. But in fact, at the very bottom are norms that are, in fact, not capable of being made completely invulnerable, and they're being attacked now as never before. So that's just one point. The second is to the brazenness and the unabashed kind of attacks, whereas other would-be tyrants might have tried to be more politic. In just the first 3 days, he has savaged he's totally insulted and terrorized, wouldn't be too strong a word, the law enforcement and the poignant articles in your hometown paper, the Washington Post, which, by the way, is taking it on the chin again and again and again, and really, the paper that brought down Nixon may be soon a vestige of its former self. But anyway, the stories of officers and their reaction to these pardons and the fear and disgust is just mind-boggling. And then finally, I would just mention on the point you made at the end, that his approach seems of a piece with just complete forward, and in no way trying to sort of make any kind of, political subtlety in the least. All right. Here's where I wanted to pick up where you were at the end when you used the word, I think it was precipice, but okay. So these are some of the biggest benchmarks and just the whole kit and caboodle. Do you have a sense, maybe this might be even harder to generalize about, but when are we good and truly fucked? In Hungary, something I, read up on a little bit in preparation for just this talk. Right now, Orban is unpopular. The opposition there's many reasons to think that if it were the democracy that it had been, he'd be out, but he's in fact consolidated enough power, including in the judiciary, that now we are talking about an outside force trying to overthrow an extant regime. And so it's like it's too late. There are a few examples of pushing back from the other side, but they're unstable and very, very, very rare. It feels like damn close to a one-way ratchet. What would be the point? So I'm with you, said it again and again. I repeat it, things to be done, things that must be done, silver linings, and places to be on the ramparts. That's basically all I'm doing now. Nevertheless, when would we say that the battle is lost? What's the point at which, even if people don't quite feel it on the street, we're on the other side?
Yes. Well, people used to ask me, because of course I started working on the Camps book so long ago, when Trump came around the first time, they said, oh, the Hitler stuff was obvious, sort of the little light parallels were obvious from the beginning, and people were asking questions, are we in that same kind of situation? And I would say, no, we're not in great shape, but what we don't have yet is there's not enough just open street violence like to really compare to, let's say, 30s Germany, to Weimar Germany. There's not enough street violence. There's no true paramilitary squad working on Trump's behalf. And we have a, wounded, slightly compromised, but still independent judiciary. And we have the ability to protest. And in the research that I did, those factors were the key things that when you had unimpeded street violence, when you had active paramilitaries that would enforce the tyrant's will without even having to roll in the justice system, the legal system, law enforcement, when you would have no more ability to protest and the judiciary was totally down the tubes, then you were well and truly fucked. And I would say in the time since people first started asking me that question, your very comments today about these police officers and, these articles that were in the Post about these pardons, I think I'd mentioned at one point in my recent newsletter about that Trump, by pardoning these guys, he's really mimicking something that Hitler did with a bunch of brownshirts who were his paramilitary group, who did his street enforcement for him before he ever came to power. And those brownshirts, they were often early concentration camp guards. And so a state's attorney brought charges against 25 brownshirts only a year into Hitler having power.
Well, you're talking 33 Germany.
Yeah.
The state's attorney, the equivalent of our, wow, news to me. Keep going. Okay.
They brought charges against 25 for mistreating concentration camp detainees. So this is a rule of law trying to hold on. Still independent law enforcement seeing what their job is. And these guys had beaten detainees. They had locked them in metal lockers and blown smoke into the lockers, almost asphyxiating these guys. They made them eat vomit. They made them do things later in the Nazi regime would seem like nothing when we read about Auschwitz and the horrors of the Holocaust. But in the beginning, these were clearly against the law. And those people charged with it came forward. State's attorney brought charges, and they were convicted. In 1934, in Nazi Germany, they were convicted. And the following year, there was this balance in Germany of whether they were really going to be heading fully extrajudicial or whether they were going to do like law and order on steroids and rein everything back into the judicial system that was already existing. Hitler pardoned the stormtrooper guards, and that was a piece of the end of independent law and order. And that was the real embrace of everything going on the campsite and everything going extrajudicial. And that is one of the moments, those pardons, where Germany was well and truly fucked. And I would say that's really bad for us. But not to silver lining it too much, we still have, in many cases, the ability to protest. I expect to see Trump clamp down on the first huge protests, any big protests that will emerge going forward. I expect we will see a strong response to that, because that is going to be something he's going to want to remove, is that ability to protest. That is one of the few things that's kind of in his way at this point. And then I have a question for you, actually.
No, you have all the questions you want, but I can't let that go. Wow. What a chilling and apposite episode that I didn't know about, but it does dovetail. We got to keep talking about this a little, Andrea, and
sure.
You can have at me for all you want, but this was, of course, what came to mind, not just at the pardons, but the immediate aftermath when Enrique Tarrio says just last night he is, and what should we expect? Triumphant, and the people who did this have to pay, and they need to be behind bars. And he has, I resisted almost just for persuasiveness and credibility, Nazi analogies for a long time, and made the point you did that are we Hitler 33? Okay, no, but is that the standard? But there have been certain features that have just seemed, inescapable, and now this, and which is 33. Hitler comes to power legally through the chancellors put him in, and that's the motto we have here. And the brown shirt squad that just go around absolutely extra legally kicking ass and worse. Well, what you've described is stunning. that I understood, was a huge sort of sea change in holy crap, it's happening. And to hear about the role, it seems like you read about it, but to hear how kind of the no way back at that point. And of course, you're right, because it means ultimately you can use the law as you like. For example, you mentioned the vulnerable groups just today. I think in the last day, the administration has done quite a bit to go after, or you could say unroll all kinds of protections for racial minorities, gays, lesbians, trans, etc. But if at the end of the day you can just send a Enrique Tarrio or one of the now additional people who gladly follow him and have meaning in their lives to kick the crap out of antagonists and any antagonist, right? We saw Trump brazenly, go after a bishop from the National Prayer Government and just call her, stupid, everything
nasty, I think, or yeah.
Yeah, I was just reminded of, and she's not my type, about E. Jean Carroll, right? These gratuitous, absolute slights. But to hear how critical and pivotal it was in Nazi Germany sends chills up my spine. And this episode is phenomenal. If you tell us some place we can find out about it or anything you've written about it, we will put it in this podcast. All right. So I've got so much more for you, but let's make it a little bit more of a conversation. What do you got for me?
So my question for you is, I know what's happened in different parts of the world, but you know the U.S. legal system far more in depth than I do with your experience. And so how quickly, like those independent pockets that we were just talking about in Nazi Germany, where people were still trying to carry out their real job as they had to taken it on pre-Hitler, how quickly and completely do you think the Department of Justice will sort of be working hand in glove with the Trump administration, ginning up legal things against political opponents? What do you see as what's going to happen to the fair-minded people of the DOJ who don't want to be doing this? And how quickly will Trump be able to use it as a tool, not just not have it against him as he's wanted for so long, but to actively make use of it?
Yeah. And this is another of the things that 8 years ago, I would have said, oh, but we've got this. And man, this is a very strong counterforce. I was at the DOJ last week for the farewell ceremony for Garland. And, as this is kind of a bromide there, but it's true. Like a lot of cliches, that the heart and soul of the department are all the career folks. We're talking, over 100,000 employees who get up. And it's been personally so infuriating to me and to everyone there to have these insults, including now with Pam Bondi and her, that's become the kind of conventional stance of the current administration, is that the old one was politicized. 100% bullshit. But how quickly? So this is one where, again, we are, and I am, rolling with the punches. But in the last 24 hours, 15 of the most important people in the National Security Division and the Criminal Division were reassigned. You can't, under the current Civil Protection Service, just fire people willy-nilly. They'll find that out. And he found that out already last time around with Andrew McCabe and others. But you can reassign them to asset forfeiture in Alaska, or one big guy now is in some kind of, pitiful, just a humiliating demotion where he's got some advisor role to something that we know that won't matter at all. You can argue that the entire Civil Rights Division was just eviscerated by a single order that they gave yesterday, basically saying, diversity and all that come with it, no muss. And we'll see how that will play out to really get down to the brass tacks on it. The latest order from this morning is from the new Deputy Attorney General instructing the field offices, which, 93 offices where the department does its work through, to look into prosecuting states or localities that are resistant to the efforts to do these immigration roundups, about sanctuary cities and just other, in California here, there's efforts that are afoot to just try to counterbalance and not let Rough Riders come through and completely. I mean, that we're going to have images of roundups in towns that are going to be of a piece, I think, with the petrified Jewish boy, in the 30s in Germany. When I was a U.S. attorney, I experienced a change in administration, and the proper thing to do was go till around April, May to ensure an orderly transition and then leave. We've had a really interesting wave of resignations before he took office, and I think it's for exactly this reason. They knew things like this were coming and they were going to get orders. And when you get orders from the Deputy Attorney General, especially when they are vigilant about following up, especially when they suspect that there is resistance in the field, the general point for U.S. attorneys, you can do a lot of stuff on your own, but when Main Justice comes and, has the boot on the neck, you better. So if they're saying they read a story in the Kansas City paper and call up the Missouri U.S. attorney and say, what the fuck? Why isn't this file open, and why aren't you? And this is a general point that goes across all kinds of things, but you can make terrible trouble and push and influence, even if you don't bring a case or bring a meritless case, just subpoenas and the like, and throwing the federal weight around. I think that's going to be quick. And what does it mean? We have, so those 15, as I told you, really important players. They're just, it's the equivalent almost of being, stripped and paraded through the halls. You have others seeing them, hearing the music, saying, I want to defend the Department of Justice. It's been my life, but I can't. I'm out of here. Jay Bratt, a very good example. He was maybe the head national security prosecutor on all of the Trump stuff, certainly to include Mar-a-Lago. And then, of course, the whole point here, the same as in Germany, I'm not shying away from it, the impact of all of this on everybody who remains, either because they think they can do a scintilla of good, or, they've got kids and a life, and they can't just make this quixotic move and quit and resign, and they think, what good would it do anyway? Today, right now, as we speak, Andrea, you have 95% of the workforce in the Department of Justice that is really the whole thing here. To hear Merrick Garland, do these testaments to him, and everyone understood where he was going, and there was like this undertone of just dread in the room. Everybody is, without a doubt, thinking it over. What am I in? So a whole area of immigration litigation was basically just shut down yesterday. So if you, depending on how much you credit or just see the broader influence of these high profile moves that everybody sees and chills the blood of everybody on every floor of the Department of Justice, the answer I fear, and it's an answer I would not have given 8 years ago, is pretty goddamn quick.
I always want to not sugarcoat, not gloss over like how bad it really is, because you can't address what's going on if you don't actually know how bad it is.
But stay calm. Yeah.
Yet it's one of those things that it's like, in movies where they drive a character to despair because they only show them the future horrors of their life and they don't show them the parts that work out, right? So I want to just emphasize, for not just your mental health, but for strategic balance, if you will, in your planning, that, we have the example of South Korea. We have the example of Poland. We have the example of Brazil, all much younger, much less stable democracies than ours, all of which have been faced in some cases with recent issues, some with ones that have already stretched more than a decade. And in each case, the people have been able to not settle any of those questions in those countries permanently, but make tremendous strides at the ballot box, in the streets, by using existing institutions, by some people standing up. And so I want to say those things will.
Do you think Poland is back? Poland's
going to have elections this year, and we'll see.
Yeah.
But it was seized from the brink by the Civic Coalition. It could have already gone last year. I mean, I have friends in Poland who were not sure if they could stay in the country. I mean, and they're still there. And they are saying, this is huge. This is not full redemption, but this is a chance to keep fighting. And I think that there will be those chances to keep fighting. But I am with you. I think that it's going to be very hard to do it from the Department of Justice, which is a shocking thing to say, but that is where we are. And so I think that, one of the things that has worked in a lot of different places around the globe that I have been recommending to people is to focus on a really local level, even though they are looking at punishing those jurisdictions that make sanctuary cities or vow to protect different vulnerable communities. Those states do have some powers of their own, and those things will take time for the judiciary to beat back and beat down. And in some cases, they're going to win on those. There's going to be some things that don't get through the courts. I have a question for you in a minute about that, which you'll give me more bad news, and that's okay. But there are a lot more ways to build that community that Trump does not want people to be connected in political ways. Think of it as not even a leftist, just sanity version of the Tea Party, right?
It is so true. This is not a left and right thing anymore.
Exactly. It is just who is looking at reality. And I got to tell you that I spent a lot of time in Russia. I first went in 2011. I've been a lot in recent years. And a bunch of the people that I have talked to there cannot even have a political conversation anymore because they are so ignorant. Even some good friends that have just kind of checked out because it's too much to deal with. Some of them are still protesting and still getting arrested. Other ones have just checked out. And those people actually can't even talk about those issues anymore. And I went down to DC. I went down to where all the inaugural events were happening on Monday. And I talked to a bunch of Trump supporters. And I will tell you, I got the same, I don't even call them cliches, the rhetoric that now stands in for original thought for them, like over and over. And there was this really surreal moment where these couples, I was like, well, what are your issues? And of course they do immigration and they're excited about Doge. And then they say, at the same time, they go, oh, drill, baby, drill. And they're just so excited that they have another catchphrase that they both can throw at me like it's a trivia quiz or something. Like they're not even thinking, right? And so I think that acting locally and connecting to people locally gets you down to a level where you might actually get people involved that weren't involved before, and where you might even redeem, as things get worse and worse that Trump does, you might even redeem a few Trump people who say, wait, I didn't sign on for this. I don't think we should wait around for those people, but I think we should let them come over if they get sick of what's happening. And the local level is where those human connections are made, because I got to tell you, that people arguing over Trump said this and Harris said this, I have never once in my life seen anybody change their mind based on that meta level national argument, right? So the only way we have a hope, I think, to reclaim a real narrative about what's going on is there at that local level. But I am sorely worried about how long these jurisdictions that sort of offer themselves as safe havens or just sane havens, if nothing else, can kind of hold out. So my other question for you is, you've already answered, how quick will DOJ be forced to fold? And how long do you think it will take, the more independent-minded circuits, the more independent-minded judges who are not leftist, but are simply actually following the rule of law, with a sympathetic Supreme Court, in the side here of Trump pretty clearly? How much room is there still to bring cases and stall things, things, or at least slow them down, in some way in this new Trump era? Like, what do you think the role, of course, is going to be? Because that's really critical in my experience in other places around the world. Is there a sliver of an independent judiciary that will remain?
Yeah. Here, the answer, I think, is fairly promising. The answer is ample, and I'll get to it in a moment. Just before I forget, I'm so fascinated and interested in this 34 states attorney theory. So a few points, man, Andrea, it's really good talking to you, but it's just so rich and troubling. I want to follow up just a quick thing on the DOJ, how long it'll take with the biggest feature, which is he comes into office already having, and from his first term from the Supreme Court, basically crushed the most important norm of all, which is absolutely canonical status until yesterday in the Department of Justice, which is no non-interference by the White House in individual cases. He has absolutely asserted that power. He could do it even criminally, and we know from the immunity opinion, as the court conceptualizes it, anytime you're talking to the Department of Justice, those are your supposed core executive powers. If that were the case, Richard Nixon would have done nothing wrong, because what he told, the main thing he did was tell the department to tell the FBI to stand down. It's a sea change. So it just begins with, even if it's not enough for the Deputy Attorney General, and any self-respecting Deputy Attorney General before would have resisted White House pressure, that's gone now. So Blanche, the new Deputy Attorney, and Bondi, and everyone will take orders from the White House, and it'll be considered a legitimate aspect of the new regime. And that's like already a horrific degradation of the Department of Justice. It's the kind of thing we are now all over World War II, but I'm thinking of now the iconic photo of Germany marching into France on the Arc de Triomphe, and that very French guy with tears running down his face. That is the Department of Justice today. People are aghast, horrified, completely thunderstruck, apoplectic, and just sad as can be. All right. Your question, though, we have this federalist system that is an important silver lining, but it sounds like it existed in some degree. I don't know if the state's attorney was for all of Germany or one of the German states, but, they had it there. But it matters. And I do think, it's really unlikely that, he's never, even in this, I think it will always remain. Now, it might be, as you say, the sort of cowed Russia where people don't even know anymore. But, man, I think we're a very long way from that. So the pockets of blue will be strong. And what can they do? A fair bit, because of the federalist system. I'll give you an example, but then why it's actually not so silver a lining here. But you can bring, we've seen, in addition to the federal cases that were dismissed, cases brought in Arizona and Michigan that against electors who lied, and those are still pending, and they sweep in, by the way, many of the president's men, Mark Meadows and Rudy Giuliani and the like. And it's going to be hard for him to shut those down. And some of them are against him. The civil ones go forward against him personally. It'd be theoretically possible for a state to bring charges if we're still within the statute of limitations. Or certainly, I think some of these jackanapes are going to commit more crimes now that they're released. And you could go after them. I do think there's a lot of state apparatus that will really push back against, when you have this heavy-handed order from the Deputy Attorney General to prosecute, what that has to mean. There's a statute, and you have to be able to show literal, interference with it's the equivalent of throwing your body in the street so that the federales can't come through. It's not fighting on policy grounds or providing. I think we will have a case where what states are doing is providing some kind of sanctuary. That's, I think, not going to prove enough for this federal criminal provision of basically, the equivalent of trying to, blockade federal.
It's like physical force of some kind.
Or in some, doing, but that's what they're going to try to apply. And then when we come to the judiciary, there's always we're going to be wanting to know, which is disgusting in and of itself. First things first, who appointed this judge? But that will be for both district court and higher. But let me go specifically to the pardons, because it turns out to be not so great. And here is why. The prosecutors for all the crimes of the people who were pardoned, federal crimes brought in the federal system of D.C., you might think, okay, well, the D.C. Regular system will pick this up and charge them. It happened in D.C. You can do the same. Guess who are the prosecutors, as it turns out, for the D.C. local system by a quirk of how things work? The DOJ. It's got a whole bunch of people who essentially function as assistant district attorneys doing street crimes in the district, because it's a federal function. And you think, well, maybe some of these are going to have possible criminal activity that you can charge out of Virginia. And maybe they would, but the Virginia state authorities, the Virginia AG is a Republican. Any Republican who tries this, the entire force of Trump, including political, will come down on like a ton of bricks. So I don't see a specific inroad for what really should happen. It's terrible 8 ways from Sunday, and it's an offense against the whole country, but it's specifically dangerous and terrifying for victims. I don't see the likelihood that states will step in to protect them. For instance, to follow up, those district judges who I just talked about, who handled all the 1,500 cases, they were saying, and this is really putting them out there for judges, don't do pardons of these folks. They've seen them at a retail level, one after the other, complete low-life assholes who, were violent and nasty, etc. And we're talking from Reagan appointees to, well, they're unrepentant now, but also they had, there was a whole series of before, lectures handed out to them by, Trump District Court Judge Nichols up to Reagan Judge Lamberth and everything in between. Don't you think to call yourself a patriot, et cetera, and even to extend to full, saying and on the bench, which is already pushing, don't give these full pardons. Among the most, I think, enraged and discouraged people in the country are those judges on the federal district court. And guess what? Some of the things when Trump tries this stuff with Doge, and there's immediately this being America, plus much of what he's doing is extra legal, immediate lawsuits. A lot of them are going to go to these very judges who have been completely, upended for the January 6th stuff, and also a court of appeals. There is always, and this includes the state stuff, as long as you can come up with some plausible federal question, there is always the terrifying specter of the U.S. Supreme Court at the end of the road, even if it comes to, the administration, after losing all the way up the road in State Court of California, brings a federal case to the Supreme Court. Remember, the ultimate half-empty, half-full moment to me in the last month or so was the 5-4 decision by the Supreme Court to let the New York sentencing proceed. There wasn't a shred of an argument in the other side, and count them four, the three who'll do anything to lick the boots of Trump. But then Justice Kavanaugh, and he and Chief Justice Roberts are almost always in the majority, 4 votes to actually stop that tiny little sliver that remained from going forward. So the court here is I think that probably wasn't the case in Germany, and they had to sort of, push through them. The court here is a very bad, on the chessboard, force that my best guess is they have no respect for Trump, but that said, they are a wild card here that is already in his corner and just 9 times out of 10, when the chips are down and Trump is up there, they're going to just completely disappoint us in a way that the culture still takes and should take, I hope, in a healthy democracy as final. But that's really a very big pile of chips on his side of the table.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think that we have to see part of the job, as depressing as it can be, is literally to force those cases through, document it all, make a record, because not just so the historians will write about it the right way, but that's literally a tool of power and resistance, is to actually have a docket, have those arguments be made, have a record of it. And that can actually be one of the things that helps to undo these things at a later point.
I've been saying it again and again for the report. I think it is so important. I go back and back to Orwell and, Essays on Democracy in the English Language, 1984. This effort, and for personal reasons, as much as cunning, he is so doubled down over Trump to just erase history. To, his claim about all his crimes is they've been somehow wiped out. He's been exonerated by the American people. All this stuff, if some of those views prevail, then however that happens, then we are well and truly fucked. Meaning, not exactly converse, contrapositive, whatever, but meaning, we have to be playing on the playing field of history, not because it's just what remains for us, but because it is really promising for, a future resurgence of democratic rules.
I would just say that in terms of, making forward, slow everything down as much as possible. Midterms are 2 years away. He's got a lot to undo to keep those from happening. And we know which way they're already inclined. So, everything is stormy, everything looks grim on these futures. But I think that there's a lot of ways to take action. And all of those, when I look at these horrific situations around the globe, the difference in the long run was these people on the ground, building community, saving lives, recording events, witnessing. That's not the same as being a spectator. So, but we are on the precipice. But even if we get to the well and truly fucked stage, it's not the end of democracy. But right now, it's the end of democracy as we know it.
Great being with you, and hope to talk to you soon and take stock of just where the hell we are.
Well, keep up the good fight. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for tuning in to One on One, a weekly conversation series from Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts, and please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we post full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. Talking Feds remains one of the very few independent productions out there, so if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. Plus, you'll get tons of perks like free access to my LA Times op-eds and the chance to join monthly live Q&A sessions. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the feds will keep talking. Talking Feds One-on-One is produced by Catherine Devine, associate producer Gabriella Glick, sound engineering by Matt McArdle, Rosie Dawn Griffin, Hamza Mehendranathan, David Lieberman, and Emma Maynard are our contributing writers. Production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu and Genesis Magpayo. Our music, as ever, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.